Hi, I'm Mark Warner, and we're here in Chicago on March 3rd, 2017, to have an opportunity to discuss with Dr. Alex Hannenberg, the 2010 ASA president, his history in the specialty and his career and how that developed. So, Alex, welcome.
Thanks, Mark.
And we'll start with a question. Where'd you come from, and how did you get to this point?
Well, it's been a long road. I was born and raised in Brooklyn, New York. I went to public schools in New York and then left the city to go to college at Vassar as a pioneer of coeducation at that time in the early 70s. From there, medical school at Tufts in Boston. And both the medical community and just generally Boston was such a great place to be that I've stayed ever since. So I'm pretty well transplanted in Boston. I'm was and still am, I think, the only physician in my extended family. Started out after medical school in internal medicine, pretty quickly realized that really wasn't my cup of tea, particularly because I had the experience of an ASA preceptorship earlier and said, this is a specialty in which people have fun, and clicked with me, and so I switched.
Alex and I were both ASA preceptors. That program got dropped soon after we went through it, and they miss a lot of people that they could bring in. So.
Yeah, I think if you look at anesthesiologists, and probably anesthesiologists in leadership roles in the specialty, at least in our generation, the frequency with which you find that in their background is pretty amazing. Going forward, and I think we'll get to this, that was definitely in my mind when I kind of designed and launched the modern day medical student research fellowship. And it's got a little bit of a different focus, but the students it attracts, I think, will also go on and do pretty amazing things. So anyway, I had medical school and post-grad training in Boston. I actually met my wife in an operating room at Cambridge City Hospital, and maybe I had such a positive association with operating rooms that anesthesiology was an obvious choice.
Very good. Well, as a fascinating, and your wife, by the way, is a general surgeon, correct?
Correct. Also trained in the Harvard system.
Yeah. So what is it about anesthesiology that really attracted you?
So I would say two things. One, the immediacy of the results. And second, I think it probably more so than any other medical specialty is one in which you're working in applied physiology every day. And I remember that there was a textbook that was my absolute go-to favorite in medical school called Pathologic Physiology by Sodeman. I don't know whether it's still published, but any disease system was traced back to the organ level, cellular level, so that you understood what the disease was as profoundly as possible. And that always was a very satisfying exercise. But with respect to the immediacy of the results, I remember as though it was yesterday, this moment during that preceptorship, this must have been 1977 or so, where a patient arrived in the pre-op area writhing with abdominal pain, and my mentor, Paul Levesque, saw the patient and connected the fact that she had had a morphine in her pre-med and that her symptoms were those of biliary colic. And he titrated tiny doses of naloxone into the patient, and just like that, she was as good as gold. And this transformation, one, understanding the physiology, morphine, sphincter spasm, colic, and reversing the morphine was just magical, and I think that was kind of in my head. But I carry that around as kind of the illustration of how magical the practice of anesthesiology can be.
That's a fascinating story. Now, as you go through your training, the opportunity as you come to completion of that training to go off in any number of ways comes up. Well, it could be academics, it can be private practice, and in any of those, organized medicine. And not everybody chooses organized medicine. How did you get involved in organized medicine, and what interested you?
Well, as I was finishing training, the clinical director in my program at Beth Israel Hospital, Dorothy Crawford, was, I think, starting her term as president of the Massachusetts Society of Anesthesiologists. And she pretty much insisted that I join her as a guest at the executive committee meeting, which I did. And mind you, I was within a couple of months of finishing my training. And somehow, by some electoral sleight of hand, she managed to have me elected as a regular member of the of the executive committee. It's one of those things you don't want to know how that happened. But it was a terrific time. 1984, 1985, the standards for basic intraoperative monitoring, the closed claims project, and in Massachusetts we were very active in that and took the findings of the closed claims project and worked with the major malpractice carrier in the state to agree upon a discount for anesthesiologists agreeing to abide by the standards and use the oximetry and capnography, which were relatively uncommon in operating rooms at that time. And what happened was, because of the discount, the devices, literally within a 6-month period, were essentially everywhere. And in that following year, serious adverse events in anesthesiology, which had resulted historically in 15 or 20 claims at this malpractice company, essentially vanished. And it was years before the next one came up. And if you don't walk away from even being a spectator, which pretty much was my role at that point, if you don't come away from that with an appreciation of how organizations driving systemic change can alter the experience of patients and elevate the standard of care, you must be asleep. So that was a pretty intoxicating experience. And G. Pierce, who had been ASA president in 1984, remained active in the Massachusetts Society and actually had come back from his ASA presidency to be chair of the State Committee on Economics. And in that role was trying to convince the Blue Cross plan in Massachusetts to pay for epidural narcotic analgesia, which was quite new at the time. And I was an early adopter of that technique and knew a fair bit, and he was looking to recruit somebody to persuade Blue Cross. So I raised my hand, and he and I went down to the boardroom at Blue Cross Blue Shield, and I made a presentation about the value of epidural narcotic analgesia, and it worked, and they agreed. So it was an amazing chance to work shoulder to shoulder with a giant like G. Pierce to sort of hone my advocacy skills at a pretty high level for a guy, a year out of residency. As soon as the dust settled from that, Jeep turned over the chairmanship of the MSA Economics Committee to me in 1988, and I'm almost embarrassed to say that I still hold that position.
So much for succession planning.
Exactly, a real challenge and something that's actually really important.
Oh, very good. That's a remarkable story. Now, when you walked into that Blue Shield, Blue Cross room with Jeep, you probably didn't have a lot of history related to economics and finances and all. How'd that happen? What where'd you go from there?
Well, I mean, and that was a job for somebody mostly familiar with the clinical history and the scientific literature around the technique. Here's the dirty little secret that not only don't I have an MBA, I actually have never taken an economics course, despite all of the involvement I've had in subsequent years on payment policy and so forth. But when I think about that experience, it was about learning how to make a case persuasively and to be honest and articulate about it.
Now, you were working with Massachusetts Society in that regard. How did you make the leap from the state level to the national level?
Interesting. This is another one of those things like the biliary colic, where I kind of remember that moment. In 1992, Medicare completely overhauled its payment system and introduced what's called the resource-based relative value scale, which had been developed by Professor Shao at Harvard School of Public Health in the late 80s, ironically in the department in which I'm now appointed. But in any event, it was adopted by Medicare in 92, and very, very rapidly the entire private health insurance industry made its transformation from usual and customary payment formula to RBRVS. And I remember this moment. I was standing in the operating room at Newton Wellesley Hospital, and the head of the big orthopedic group came up and said, "Oh, did you hear that such and such a plan is switching over to RBRVS?" And I said, "Yeah, I did." And he suggested that he'd looked at it and didn't think that it was a particularly monumental change in any way. And I said, "Gee, I wonder whether that's true for us too." And I went back over the following weeks and months, and I fired up, I think must have been Excel version 1.0, and started accumulating Medicare fee schedule data and private health payment data, and realized that transformation pretty much resulted in an across-the-board 50% or greater cut in anesthesia payments, very different from the assessment that I had just heard about in orthopedics. And so I began talking locally to leaders in our state society, who in turn began talking to folks at ASA about this. And as a result, I think it was Bernie Wechsler appointed me to the ASA Committee on Economics, just as ASA was preparing to make its case at the Relative Value Update Committee, which is kind of the stratosphere of physician payment gurus, to adjust the anesthesia payment to compensate. And so Butch Thomas and Chuck Novak, who were really important in my development in these roles, took me along to the RUC to use the information I had compiled. And that really is where this problem that plagues us today, really known as the 33% problem, was first identified on Excel version 1.0 at Newton Wellesley Hospital.
So you're the guy responsible for the 33%?
Well, I'm not responsible for the problem. I'm responsible for identifying it and quantifying it and making the case that we were really an outlier with respect to the impact of RBRVS. And I brought something with me today to show you. This is a monograph produced in about '95, and you can tell it's vintage because it's formatted to create overhead transparencies. Medicare is the wrong benchmark for commercial anesthesia payments, and all across the country everyone was concerned that as health plans made that transformation to RBRVS, the impact on our specialty would be devastating. So people were taking this to negotiations with health plans on fee schedules and did very well with it. I remember I had a conversation with an anesthesiologist in a group in Hawaii who took it to the Hawaii Blue Cross plan and came out having convinced them that they shouldn't mirror 125% of Medicare in anesthesia. One of the reasons I remember it was the next day this enormous box of orchids arrived from Hawaii. He was so pleased with the result. But this made a big mark, and I always joke and say that monograph is what kind of launched my career that culminated in ASA presidency.
Well, you did so much with the Economics Committee. How did that expand what you did within ASA?
Well, so I served, I don't know, 8 or 10 years on the ASA Economics Committee. I was chair in, I think, 2002 or so, and was really very happy, focused on that area. Had no aspirations for elected office. In fact, found it rather unappealing. In 2003, 2004, a new position was created, Vice President for Professional Affairs, which covered a bunch of things. I was interested in economics being one, but patient safety and quality measurement and governmental affairs. And I have to say it was kind of irresistible. And so I ran for that office. I was the first person to occupy it, which I did for about 4 years. And as you know, there's kind of a culture in the society, for better or for worse, about dwelling in a particular elected position too long. And to some extent it was, do I step away from that and ASA, or do I go further? So I ran for first vice president.
Much to our benefit.
Nice of you to say, but there are a whole bunch of areas that needed work that then were kind of in my wheelhouse that I undertook.
So you come from a background of private practice, and not all ASA presidents do that. Matter of fact, the majority of our members.
I'd love to count that up sometime because
We really should.
Because I think if you talk to an academic, they will say, well, the whole thing is dominated by private practice guys, and if you talk to a private practice guy in anesthesia, they say ASA is run by the academics. So it'd be
a curious perspective, isn't it?
Yeah, it's always been puzzling to me.
Oh my! So when you look at the membership, in terms of the proportionality of private practice, academics, how does that play out for you, and how did coming out of private practice help or hinder you?
Right, well, I think obviously the overwhelming majority of ASA members are in private practice, and I suppose being an officer with that background probably gave lots of members some comfort that I lived in their world, not something substantially different. So in that sense, it was an advantage. But that advantage carried with it an obligation to really earn the trust of the academic community in anesthesia, and I went into that path, the president pathway, very aware of the need to do that. And fortunately, not by my design, but fortunately I had the opportunity to serve on the Foundation for Anesthesia Education and Research Board for 9 to 10 years, which was a terrific opportunity to understand the issues in science and teaching and academia. And of course I had an excellent tutor by my side the whole time, because you followed me by one year as ASA president, and whenever a question arose about science, research, teaching, I had a truly authoritative tutor by my side. But the opportunity to build relationships with really the giants of academic anesthesiology by serving at FAIR was enormously valuable. And I remember walking into my first FAIR meeting, and everyone had their little tent card there, and it was Miller and Barish and Cullen and Stolting and Sessler and so forth. And my thought bubble was, wow, that looks an awful lot like my bookshelf. But terrifically talented people, and I'm forever grateful because despite coming from a very different place, they were enormously welcoming. And one of the things I left my service at FAIR probably most proud of was the Medical Student Anesthesia Research Fellowship, and the route to creating that tells a really nice story about the people and the organization. So in probably 2004 at annual meeting, Mike Todd, who was then editor-in-chief of the journal, gave a luncheon talk. And one of the things he emphasized in that luncheon talk was that everyone he could think of who had made major contributions to our knowledge in anesthesia had the research and science bug really early. He said, high school, college, medical school, and he rattled off a bunch of names and told his own story. And I walked out of that luncheon with Mike Rosenthal, who was then chair of the FAIR board. He was a lovely, lovely man. And I said, as a newcomer to the FAIR board, I said, so Mike, listening to that, you'd have to think that FAIR is intervening too late, that we're targeting residents and junior faculty, and here Mike Todd is saying, you want people on that track a lot earlier, and we should be targeting medical students. And Mike said, yeah, really good idea, let's do that. And the amazing thing was, this was October, and that following summer, we had our first group of 15 medical students in some of the most prestigious and productive academic departments in the country. And that program has persisted. I think probably 400 students have benefited from the Medical Student Anesthesia Research Fellowship. But nimble organization, open-minded, some schmo from community practice comes along with this idea, and the giants of academia embrace it. It was a great experience.
They knew high quality and great ideas when they heard them. Alex, you carried a lot of weight, and people believed in you a lot when you did that. So it's been a remarkable program. And like you say, it's kind of been a successor to the ASA preceptorship, although in a different track. But
correct. So because it's a different time. In the 70s, the issue was attracting American medical graduates to the specialty. That obviously is not a problem today. But I think many people feel as though too few of those who train in anesthesiology commit their career to research and teaching. And this is meant to give medical students the bug, and clearly the people applying for and selected for this are predisposed to anesthesiology. But what we hope is going to happen is that they're going to train in anesthesiology, have good research experience through their training, and stick with it. And I think FAIR is going to monitor the success of that. But all of the mentors who are the creme de la creme of the research community in our specialty have a lot of faith that it's happening. And when the medical students at annual meeting present their posters, the number of department chairs and program directors who are there recruiting these kids is very impressive. So they obviously think the program and the participants are worthwhile.
So just for our audience, so you're aware, Dr. Hannenberg is a true Renaissance man, because here's a person who also got the bug and who went basically from private practice and is very involved in academics as a clinical professor and very involved in academics now. So it's been a remarkable career to watch that transition.
Well, I think of myself as a late blooming academic in that I think my first funded research work occurred at age 60. So that took a little while to manifest itself.
You're going to skew the statistics.
but it's so I'm still in touch with my department chair from when I was a residency, who was in his 80s, and I frequently torture him about the fact that I didn't really have a substantial research exposure as a trainee, and I think had that occurred, I might have been on that track earlier. And one of my greatest concerns about these medical student research fellowship students is that they wind up doing their residency training in a place that will offer them an experience that keeps the bug alive. So it's not kind of a one shot and you're done. And as I said, had I had a research fellowship when I was a medical student or resident, I might have got on the train a little bit earlier than I have.
So let's make a little switch and talk about your time in ASA leadership, particularly on the executive committee, because you were there during an incredibly important time in our history as a country with the Affordable Care Act introduction. You want to talk about how that turned out and how it worked?
Yeah, correct. I mean, I think the first observation is that then and now, the opinions of ASA members on the Affordable Care Act are as diverse as they are among the American public in general, and that's pretty diverse. So the policy decision, and this mostly played out during my predecessor Roger Moore's term as the legislation was taking shape. The policy decision was, what are ASA's priorities in advocacy on this law? And it may seem obvious to us, but I don't think it was obvious to all our members, that ASA wasn't really going to advocate on what the Affordable Care Act said about abortion rights or immigrants or so forth and so on. That we were going to identify the issues that were the priority for the practice of anesthesiology, focus on those because those are things on which we could gather a consensus across the specialty. And furthermore, those were going to be issues on which nobody else was going to advocate. And as it turned out, that principal focus was the 33% problem, because the risk of either a public option under the Affordable Care Act or a policy governing the healthcare exchanges that would impose the Medicare payment framework would be catastrophic. And so the principal focus of our advocacy was preventing that 33% problem from proliferating. And ASA is an amazingly effective, focused, and persuasive advocacy engine in Washington, and was 100% successful on that front. And at the time, when I asked, because obviously there was a lot of sensitivity about budget deficit and what the price tag on the ACA would be, when I asked, what are the dollars and cents associated with shielding us from that problem, I was told 40 to 50 billion with a B dollars. So that was a pretty big concession on the part of the House Democratic leadership. So the bill was up for vote in the House in, I think it was the first week in November of my term, so several weeks after I had taken office. And at that point, the House leadership was looking for us to say something positive about it. And lots of members had lots of feelings about whether the Affordable Care Act was a good thing or a bad thing.
They still do, I think.
And they still do. That's exactly right. And when we said we can support the House but not the Senate bill, there were a lot of people who said, I don't like what it does about abortion rights, or I don't like how it treats immigrants, or it's big government, or whatever the objection might be. How could you do that? And so my answer to that would be that having gotten that concession from the leadership in the House of Representatives and the Senate, that then turning around and opposing the bill was about the best definition of political suicide I could think of. And had we done that, we might as well have just folded up the pack, closed the Washington office, because nobody in Congress would ever talk to us again. So we achieved our advocacy goal, and the rest just followed. So in a sense, I think people felt as though there was this huge decision to make at that point, but there really weren't a lot of options, and our course was clear. Just by interest, we opposed the Senate bill because it included this independent payment advisory board, which most members of the House actually opposed, and would have given this unaccountable board authority over payment issues. That actually is part of the law, but there's so much controversy around it. The payment board has never been constituted or funded, and so we really haven't heard anything about it.
You know, Alex, that's a great story and accurately describes exactly what happened, which I think a lot of members don't understand. What's the behind the scenes story is the setting and environment that you were in personally as all this was occurring. So you'd just become ASA president, but you were in Hawaii. So you have two wonderful daughters. Could you describe why you're in Hawaii and how that all played into this, which added to the angst and the discussion as we went through that?
Yeah. So I have to admit, I felt a little bit guilty walking up and down the beach talking to irate members about this, and actually we had an all-member webinar in the 72 hours before the bill was up for a vote, and I was terribly afraid that the sound of the waves lapping in the background would be evident on the webinar. But my wife and I were in Hawaii awaiting our daughter's return from a year's tour in Iraq. Her duty station was Schofield Barracks in Oahu, and you probably know this, most people probably don't, that the military will never tell you exactly when troops are going to arrive because they don't want to compromise their safety in transit. So we were given the window of a week, and we're sitting in Hawaii waiting for the word that she was coming home. And she came home safe and sound, and it was a great relief, but we were fairly anxious on issues other than the Affordable Care Act at the time.
And that was a very important time when you think of Iraq and the conflict there. She was there during a very tumultuous year where improvised explosive devices were still prominent. She was traveling up and down the roads where they were. I mean, so you had a lot of reason to be in Hawaii.
If it weren't for the introduction of the those new vehicles, the MRAPs, they're called, she wouldn't be here. Because very shortly after she got that, she was actually in an IED attack and survived unscathed, and I attribute that to the improved hardware that
So that's
provided.
the traditional Paul Harvey rest of the story, which is a remarkable story when matched up with the Affordable Care Act being introduced within a few weeks of you becoming ASA president.
Correct, as I said. But I think if you look back, our advocacy machine, our PAC and Government Affairs Office in Washington is thriving and doing every bit as well, if not better, if you look at the safe VA care issue that just transpired, as it ever has. And I think one of the consequences of having been situationally aware of our choices about dealing with the Congress on the Affordable Care Act, I'd point to that as having been an opportunity to save it.
So the Affordable Care Act introduced a variety of things, and it seems to me the performance measurement was linked directly to ACA, or was it separate? And then how did you get involved in that, and what's happened with that?
Right, so when I became Vice President for Professional Affairs about 2004, obviously it substantially predated the Affordable Care Act, but I was hearing from the Leapfrog Group or the Pacific Business Group on Health, conglomerates of major purchasers of healthcare, the drive for performance measurement and paying for value. They were saying it makes no sense for us to pay the same for poor care as we do for good care. So there was this drumbeat, actually more so in the private sector than in government at that time, demanding performance measurement. And my view was this is inevitable. It clearly will be picked up in government policy, and we need to engage. Now, that whole subject across medicine and certainly within anesthesiology is very controversial, and for good reason. Even today, almost 15 years later, I would say that there are significant limitations and flaws to our ability to measure physician performance. We're not really that great at risk adjustment, particularly in a specialty like ours. Attribution of responsibility for a metric is hard. So all those flaws existed then and exist now. But this is one of those things where once you realize it's inevitable, you need to buckle down and make the best of it. Our organization struggled with that, to put it mildly, and there was a lot of resistance. There was a lot of hell no, we won't go. And even in our Committee on Performance and Outcomes Measures, which had been created to do exactly this work. And so to some extent, it felt like a pretty lonely job at the time, and that was mostly on my shoulders. But Gene Sinclair and Fred Guidry, who were presidents at that time, clearly understood, were very supportive, and gave me all the opportunity to try to make the best of this for ASA. The awareness that this was going to be an important part of our future practice was one of the reasons that I began strategizing about what became the Anesthesia Quality Institute and the registry, and kind of brought that over the finish line, I think, when I was president-elect. And I'll be the first one to say both our performance measures and our registry are not perfect. But it is clearly one of those dimensions of our work in which perfect is the enemy of good. And if you never start, you'll never finish. And there are all kinds of aphorisms about that, but I think they apply splendidly well to this topic. And now you see how important a qualified clinical data registry is to running a practice and surviving under modern payment systems. And I think had we not started building it when we did, we would be very substantially behind where we need to be, behind other specialties. And in fact, I think we're quite a bit ahead of most other specialties as a result.
So performance measurement had kind of a progressive movement over the last decade or so. The Affordable Care Act was kind of like an earthquake. And it's not the only earthquake that occurred when you were ASA president. So when Haiti had their issues in 2010, how did that affect you and ASA? And then, more importantly, over the span of your career now since then, how has that affected you and what have you done?
Well, first, the outpouring of generosity among ASA members in response to the earthquake in Haiti in January of 2010, so again, quite early in my term, was inspiring. But it also highlighted the fact that we didn't really have any mechanism for marshaling that, organizing it, or being prepared for managing that volunteer effort within ASA. ASA members have a long history of global humanitarian volunteerism, but it was clear that that was all happening outside of ASA. And as ASA president, I mean, it was almost as though I was sitting with, one phone here with an ASA member volunteering, I want to help, how can I help? And another phone here from an organization trying to do work on the ground saying we need anesthesiologists. This was, compared to many other natural disasters, an extremely surgical natural disaster. So the need for our services was greater than it was, in Ebola, for example. And we didn't really have a mechanism. And actually, you and I worked together to take the singular focus of ASA's work in global health, namely our overseas teaching program, which had been in place since the 70s or 80s, and expand its portfolio to include managing volunteerism, providing education, two-way education for young anesthesiologists overseas and for American anesthesiologists wanting to broaden their horizons. And I think that's been a very successful venture. I was a little sensitized to this issue about where ASA was in global health and healthcare in the poor corners of the world because, as I guess it must have been first vice president, attended the World Congress. And during that meeting, which was my first World Congress, I sat in on discussions of what was then called the Global Oximetry Project. And this was an initiative between the World Federation and the Association of Anesthetists of Great Britain and Ireland to elevate the basic standard of monitoring in places lacking any monitoring, and they devised and had manufactured a oximeter specifically for this purpose. Now, mind you, this is 20 or more years after oximetry became standard of practice in rich countries and was largely absent in the rest of the world. And it just seemed like a perfect philanthropic focus for anesthesiology. And I was kind of surprised that this is the first time I had heard about it, and I think our World Congress delegation had not engaged in it the way they should have, but it was an irresistible opportunity, and I kind of made it my business, and therefore ASA's business, to become an important partner in moving this forward. That project gave rise to the Lifebox Foundation. And when it came time to create a presence for the Lifebox Foundation in the United States, its founder, Atul Gawande, surgeon, author, researcher, just a giant, approached me. We had gotten to know one another about joining him in the founding board of Lifebox US. And it has been a very successful and important part of the Lifebox effort globally, which in 5 short years, really on a shoestring, has provided 14 or 15,000 oximeters in the poorest countries in the world and trained 5,000 or 6,000 clinicians. It's been an amazing project, and my work with Gawande on Lifebox has given rise to the opportunity to collaborate on surgical safety work around emergency checklists and so forth, and my part-time appointment at Ariadne Labs and Harvard School of Public Health. So that is how I became a late-blooming researcher, was through the invitation of Gawande, who has surrounded himself with just an amazing group of people, so it's really quite exhilarating.
You know, Alex, we've heard a lot about your professional life. Hadn't heard much about your private life in terms of what do you like to do? What do you do to relax? What do you and Carol do? What do you like to do, go see, whatever?
Well, we are New Englanders, so we have kind of winter focus and summer focus. So summer spring and fall, it's all about the ocean. And so we have a cottage on Cape Cod, and I've got a small motorboat that I take out around Martha's Vineyard and fish for bluefish and bass and bonito and so forth, and look forward to doing as much of that as I possibly can. In the winter time,
And
well,
all your
actually,
catches are this big, right?
they are this big. Well, and some days you go out and you don't catch any fish, but on the other hand, I've seen more sunrises over the ocean than anybody deserves to see, and that's I never tire of it. And another big interest is cooking. And so when I'm working full time, it's hard to do that, but certainly on weekends or when we're down at the beach, I love to mess around in the kitchen, and actually just came back last weekend from a cooking course at the Culinary Institute of America in New York, and hope to be able to do more of that. My wife is in the process of retiring from working. She trained as a general surgeon, worked as an emergency surgeon as well. And as you mentioned, I have one daughter still in the Army. She's an ROTC instructor at the MIT program, so has a bunch of young cadets to mold into military leaders, and the other one's in the finance world. It's funny, neither Carol nor I had any background or experience in athletics of any kind, and I think we had a little mutation. It may have been radon in the basement or something, because both the girls, Claire played Division I basketball at Villanova, and Emily was a 3-time national women's fencing champion. So that's been an important part of their lives.
It is fascinating how they develop that, when in fact you tend to have a little bit of an aversion to some of those sports. Must have been Carol that had the...
Well, we, like good parents, we tried not to meddle or pressure or push. And I'm willing to say I changed my mind. For a variety of reasons, the experience of being engaged in athletics, particularly in college, I think was of tremendous value. For one thing, it takes a lot of time, and it puts time pressure on them, and they can't help but become efficient and organized. And that's a skill that money can't buy. And you take that with you through the rest of your life. So I think that in balance, having invested the time to ferry them back and forth from games and tournaments and so forth was well worth it. The other thing is, making the transition from high school to college, which can be traumatic and difficult, I think is a lot easier when you show up with kind of a group. You go and all of a sudden you've got these buddies on the fencing team or the basketball team, and you're not confronted with whatever it is, 5, 10, 20,000 students and just dropped in there. That also is a great fringe benefit of collegiate athletics, which I missed. But
So Alex, any last words you'd like to say to your ASA members and to anyone involved or interested in our specialty?
Well, people, often say, reflecting on experiences like mine in anesthesiology, that I got far more than I gave, and I think that's absolutely true. I mentioned before, the experience of working at FAIR, working with an amazing group of officers, probably, honestly, you most among them. And those friendships. But when you think about coming from the professional background I do, private practice, suburban community hospital, for me to have the kind of collaborations and friendships with people like you and Alan Sessler and Denny Ward, and the list goes on, Atul Gawande, is an incredible gift. And I don't think very many people practicing and working like I do have had that opportunity. So I feel incredibly lucky and grateful.
And we're very grateful to Dr. Alex Hannenberg. You've just heard from someone that I consider one of the true people that we'd like to emulate when we're anesthesiologists and as people. So Alex, thank you, and been great being a close associate and friend.
The pleasure is mine.